All right. So upon request,
Saeed ben Avraham.
dedicate the class to Saeed ben Avraham, whose yahrzeit is today. Recently only discovered,
Right.
or the family only recently rediscovered his yahrzeit, being observed with Kaddish, etc.
Who is it?
It's the grandfather of Arma.
Wife's great-grandfather.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we get to the actual Gemara, I want to do just a little something about Zayin Adar, and then a little clarification at the end of yesterday. We kind of rushed through a little piece at the end of Gemara. I want to do some clarification there. Okay, so Zayin Adar, of course, is the birthday and yahrzeit of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's Gemara comments that there's something special about one who born. What's the pasuk? Has complete years. Shnoisav Amale, at the pasuk. Where Hashem said, no, there's a pasuk where Hashem praises one who Hashem says he's going to complete their years. They'll have full years when they're born and pass away in the same day. And Moshe Rabbeinu is one such individual. It's Mitzvah Yemecha Amale, that's the word I'm looking for. It's the pasuk. And Moshe Rabbeinu is born and passed away in the same day on the 7th of Adar. 1 second, it's Adar Aleph or Adar Beis? Machlokes. That's right. Whether it was the first Adar or the second Adar.
Yeah. It was
So let's just
Living Torah this week that there was the Rabbi was discussing with
I left.
some. Did you see it?
No.
Oh, they had a whole debate about it, about the machlokes.
About whether it's first day or second, first month or second.
I couldn't follow. After I watched it again, I couldn't follow it.
I didn't get to see it this week.
But isn't it very common within Judaism that when people die of old age, they usually die around their birthday?
Common? I don't know how common it is, but it's something the Gemara makes of note. That's like a praiseworthy idea. At any rate,
When's your birthday?
at any rate, sir.
So I got another. I'm still good for the bit.
So I want to share is that the Gemara tells us, this is a rather famous Gemara, and the question on the Gemara that I'm about to ask is also rather famous, and perhaps the answer is also well known, but nonetheless, the Gemara tells us that when Haman cast lots as to which month he should destroy the Yidden, it landed in different months, and he rejected the different months because every month had something of merit for the Jews, and he didn't want to try destroying them on a month when they have merit. Until finally it landed at Adar, and then he said this is a good month because Moshe Rabbeinu passed away in this month. And the Gemara comments that he didn't know that Moshe was also born in this month. So he thought it was a negative month because Moshe passed. He didn't know Moshe was born, so it was a positive month. And the obvious question is, if Haman was such a scholar that he knew the day of Moshe's death, why did he not know from the very same source that it was also Moshe's birth? What was he missing?
Simple explanation.
Many different answers to this.
His death is mentioned in the Torah, but his birth you have to refer from Psukim.
Many different answers. The verse does not mention the date; it just mentions that he passed.
No, but we know 30 days.
You can infer it.
Yeah, anyway. But the birth, it requires much more inference.
At any rate, many different answers, of course, to this famous question, and one of them is as follows. Haman knew, technically speaking, that Moshe was born and passed away on the same day. But in Haman's view of the world, death cancels birth. So he lived very nice, but now it's over. So it's a negative thing. He didn't understand that birth, that the accomplishments of the tzaddik that he did during his life live on in even post his death. In fact, one could even say, I haven't seen this written somewhere, but one could even say, the Gemara's term is, Levi you didn't know, but that in that day he was born. Not just that day, 120 years earlier, but that day of his death, he was also born. Because for a tzaddik, every day is a birth, every day is a growth, even after his death. And certainly on a yahrzeit, which as the Zohar describes on the day of a yahrzeit, all of the work that a tzaddik does gets a whole new elevation. So on his yahrzeit, on his death, there's also a birth in the spiritual sense. And that's what he was lacking. So it's not just that there's another merit that cancels the death. He misunderstood what death of a tzaddik means. To him, death of a tzaddik means like death for everybody else. It canceled, his life was lived, and now it's done, it's over. He didn't understand that for a tzaddik, even after death, he continues to live in a spiritual sense. And Boy B'Yom Neled, his birth continues even on that day of his death, and in living on in those who he taught, and in the words he shared, and the Torah he lived, and the work he did. So that's a little something about Zayin Adar.
Also, what they say is that he made the extension to Jewish people. After the Churban, they're in exile. I thought they were like dead.
Yeah.
Didn't realize we are reborn, because even if we are in exile, and even if we do suffer with the Torah and mitzvahs, so eventually Hashem will have Raku. That's what happened. That was actually
Even within our death, even within our state of Galus,
that's what happened to him, actually. He thought there was like Yeshna Amechad before they thought he could finish in a country.
Yeah.
He went down and they went.
Yashnim mitzvahs.
Yeah.
Okay. Now a little clarification from yesterday. So yesterday we're talking about proper spacing. We began the discussion on proper spacing when we're writing a Torah. So we began with the size of the sheets of parchment, right? Because it's not one long sheet of parchment; it's a number of sheets of parchment stitched together. And we talked about, firstly, the size of these sheets, and we said that they should be such that they hold a minimum of 3 columns per sheet and a maximum of 8, right? And then we said that one should not try to make the columns too small to squeeze 3 into a tiny little sheet, nor should he try to expand them so that he has a long sheet that can fit still 8. He should make them normal sized columns, and that is, we said it was the amount of space it would take to write the word Lemishbechaisehem, which is a large word of 10 letters each, 3 times that word. So it's about 32 letters per line. That's the width of your column, and that don't go too big, don't go bigger than that, don't go smaller than that, stay in that range, and then try to make your columns 3 per page, 3 per sheet, or maximum 8 per sheet. Then we said, and this is where I want to do the clarification, we kind of rushed through this, that when it gets to the last column, you're with me, Robert?
Well, I had this question yesterday. If
Yeah.
you have 3, okay, that makes sense because you've already established your width of each
Column.
But how do you get 8 and maintain the width of those
If you have bigger sheets.
Oh, bigger sheets.
Yeah, it's talking about when you're cutting your sheets. No, you're making the sheets, right?
Okay.
So it's instructing you how you should make your sheets, that they match this.
But the sheets are all uniform in the Torah?
So they're not necessarily. That's what we said yesterday. For example, if you had a sheet that is the size of 9, you happen to have a sheet that's the size of 9 columns, 9 properly spaced columns, then you should, rather than divide it between 3 and 6, do it 4 and 5.
Okay.
Right? So we should try to keep them. They're not uniform, but at least keep them somewhat.
But actually, the actual length and width of the sheet is not specified.
No, that's the point.
It's up to the writer himself.
Okay.
Whatever size he takes.
Likewise,
the columns into that. There's no
it doesn't
standard
say.
size.
It also doesn't. Well, we're going to learn about different sizes for spacings, but we're not going to learn what the size of a letter is. So if you can make the letters legible and following all the details of every letter, then you can go as small as you'd like. All right, so it doesn't tell you. So it is made to scale.
Yeah, really,
So if you have letters, if you can make legible letters that are very, very small, then go for it. And then all of a sudden your sheet, your columns shrink because you can get 33 letters in a much smaller space, and your sheet shrink and your whole Torah shrinks, or likewise bigger. But it's scaled to the size of your letters as long as you can make them properly. But the spacing is what we're going to talk about relative to your letters.
So let me ask you this. So
Yeah.
from one Torah to another, the
Yeah.
way the columns are written, the length of the column and the amount of letters, are all the columns uniform, like from one Torah to another? I don't know if I'm asking.
No, within each Torah they're uniform. From one Torah to the next, it could be different.
Okay.
So let's put it this way: all Torahs will have columns that are roughly 30-something letters wide.
Right.
Question is, how big are your letters?
No. Okay. So here, let me re-ask the question. Now, okay, if one Torah has from where you open it
Yeah.
to the end,
Yeah.
if it has, I don't know, let's say 150 or 250 columns,
Let's say.
should every Torah have the same 150 or 200?
No.
No.
No, because
So-
it also doesn't tell you how tall your column should be.
Okay. Go
We don't
ahead.
have a limit on that either.
Okay.
So the size of your letters can be different from Torah to Torah,
Okay.
as well as the height.
No, size of the letters I understand.
But also the height.
Smaller,
Also the height.
Using less parchment.
I guess you're asking is there is no uniform as to what word should be at the top of each column.
Okay.
That doesn't exist.
Okay.
So you can have taller columns, for taller sheet, but I mean, animals are only so big, so you only have sheets that are so big,
Right.
right? But I guess if you had
It's
a big sheet and you make tiny letters, you can probably get much more. Sorry?
Sorry, they're made from animals?
Yes. The parchment's made from that. The
Skin of the animal.
Bark or something?
no, it's made from the skin of a kosher animal.
Oh, okay.
We'll learn about all of that as we go along. But spacing is what we're going to do. We're going to learn about all the spacing relative to the size of your letters and how tall, I guess, your sheets are. Okay, so here's the clarification I want to make. We said that when it comes to, so this standardized size column, which is what everything comes down to, because it's relative to that. The standardized size column, that is, a column should be as wide as 30 something letters. We said it's true of all columns with the exception of the last one. So I want to be clear about what that means. So what he means is as follows. We mentioned last week that you have to conclude the Torah, you have to organize your writing of the Torah as such that you conclude the last word in the center of the bottom line. Right? So now you're coming to the end of your second to last column and you only have one verse left. How are you supposed to get that one verse to stretch over an entire column?
You said last time you start at the bottom and then you...
Still, how do you fill the entire column? You only have one verse. If you have to make the column as wide as 33 letters, how are you going to do that? So this is what the halakha is telling us. It's what Rashi explains it to us. That this standard of not making your lines too wide and not making your lines too narrow, that is, they should be standardized 30-something letters, does not apply to the last column. Do what you need to make sure that your Torah ends at the middle of the bottom line, even if it means the last column will only be the width of 2 letters.
Okay.
That's the point of that last thing that I want to clarify. Typeset even elaborates on that. Even if there are other standardized things not mentioned here. For example, you asked about how long the column should be. But actually the truth is that the Typeset mentions from a different tractate where it says you're supposed to have 60 lines per column. So there is a standard of height. But still, I don't know that every Torah begins with the same word at the top of the page. So he says that, for example, doesn't apply to the last thing. So you can make, let's say, a column of 10 lines, and it's only 2 letters wide, and therefore you stretch out a whole verse onto one last column, so that your column ends at the middle of the bottom.
So the start of the Torah and the end of the Torah will always be the same.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why
Well, the start for sure, but the end, yes, by law, has to be the same. Correct.
start and finish. Start always the same. Finish always
Yes,
the same.
but the last column might be different from one Torah to the next, because let's say he has 10 verses to go, and he can't spread that out over a column that has
It ends the same in the sense that it's
in the bottom center of the page. Correct. That's correct. Yes, okay. That was the clarification I wanted to make from yesterday.
Why does it have to end at the bottom?
We talked about this last week.
Okay.
It should be in the bottom and the middle. Okay. Now we get to some more spacing, issues of spacing. What do they call it? Word?
Margins.
No. On computer. when you're-
Typesetting?
Typesetting. There you go.
Is that it?
That's the word. Typeset. It's a whole job in the industry. Someone writes a book, but you have to have someone to typeset it to make the pages look nice and everything. So this is what it is. Typeset.
These are the typewriters.
Ancient typeset, or handmade typeset. We are 12 lines from the bottom of the page. The line begins with the word echad, and there's a little test right after the word echad, and that's where we are. There you have it. Okay. Shir Gilyon, the size of the margin. Malamata, below your text. Yeah, sorry, the page is Lamed Amud Aleph. 30a. 30 Lamed with one dot on the bottom of the page. Shir Gilyon, the size of your margin. Malamata, the bottom of your page. So under your column, there should be a margin, right? Because it's hard to read, especially when you're reading fast in the Torah, or reading public enough if you're reading fast. But to go all the way to the bottom, it's easy to lose for your eyes to lose sight of the words if it's squeezed in all the way to the bottom of the page. So you want to leave a margin. It's much easier to read.
Also for tears.
Sorry, for tears as well. Because it's also, actually the main reason is because we're worried you're going to lean your hand on the text itself and it'll end up ripping. That's true. That's correct. That's the main reason. Not just for the reading, but also because we're worried about you touching it.
And also during Hagba and Galila, you have to be careful.
Yeah, raising the Torah, lowering the Torah, we're worried about the bottom being ripped, so you want to leave some. That's true. That's correct. I'm sorry. That was the main reason. that the margin should be big at the bottom, namely a tefach. So a tefach is the size of a fist. Milamaila, the margin at the top of the page, so it's less likely to be ripped over there. It's also easier to see, to read. So there, the margin is somewhat smaller. Gimel etzba'is should be at least 3 fingers, the size of 3 fingers. So it's a little bit smaller than the top margin. 3 fingers, a little bit smaller than the bottom. Now, bein daf ladaf, between each column, how much space do you need? Kamalei revach, like the width, reichav, like the space, reichav of the width of shtei etzba'is, 2 fingers. So 3 fingers in the top, 2 in between each column, and a full fist in the bottom. Now the next little line is like kind of in parentheses. Uvuchumashin, if you're writing a chumash, that is to say, we don't have printers, so we're not printing books. You're writing out a scroll just for you to use at home, not for public reading when you're obligated to read from the actual Torah, but just to read at home and to learn. So you also have to have margins just to make it, I guess, also so people don't rip, and likewise it's easy to read. When it comes to making that, melamat at the bottom, shalosh esbois, only 3 fingers at the bottom as opposed to the full tefach like you would in a proper Torah. Melamayla at the top of the page, shtei esbois, 2 fingers as opposed to the 3 fingers at the top of the regular Torah. Bein daf ladaf, between each column, kamalei revach reichev, gadol, like the space of the width of your thumb, as opposed to 2 fingers in the actual Torah. Close parentheses with respect to making a chumash. Now he's back to making the actual Torah. Okay. Now, bein shita l'shita, between each line, kamalei shita should be the same space as your line. So again, it's relative to the size of letters you choose to make. But between each line, there should be the space of a line. So how do you make lines in the Torah? There's something called shirtut, right? That's a shirtut. If you look closely, next time you get an aliyah in the Torah, you'll see that there's a little there's a line made, like an indent, on top of every line. And that holds all the letters in order, that they shouldn't, like, when you write by hand, you have a tendency to go lower as you go to the end of the line. So you want to keep it straight, to have a shirtut. So it's, what they do is they take like a kind of pen, or kind of like a inkless pen, or like a little a razor, but not strong enough to cut the actual, strong enough to cut the actual parchment, and they indent the line in the actual parchment.
Like a scratch.
Like a scratch.
They call it scoring in English.
Scoring, that's the word.
That's the
word, scoring. And they do it at the top of the line because most letters have a bar or something at the top. The bottom of the line, the bottom of the letters usually end in a little peg sometimes, right? So it doesn't, it's harder to measure from there going upward. It's much easier to measure from the top going downward. So before you write, you have to make these scratches to know where your lines are going to be. So you know, relatively speaking, how big your letters are. So make your line such that you have space for writing your line, plus the space of that size of your line, and then your next line. That's what he says here.
The yud wouldn't work very well if you didn't.
If you had a yud,
if you did it on the bottom, where do you put the yud?
The yud would be suspended. You hard to do it. Yeah.
That's before the top line.
Before the, I guess Torah is assembled. Let's say you know. Let's say you're starting off, like, what's the process before starting to write the Torah? Like, you have X amount of parchment, or you need X amount of parchment?
I suppose the first thing is you want to decide how big your letters are. How big your letters are going to be, right? And then once you know how big your letters are going to be, you can grow from there. So I have these size letters. I can fit X amount of letters on a line. I can fit X amount of letters on a column. This is the size of my parchment. How much space do I need at the top and the bottom? I guess we work that way. It's a skill. It's a real skill. That's why these things are.
But, so I'm not asking the question correctly. What's the first thing?
Yeah.
Before putting the lines, is the Torah assembled as the parchment is?
Oh, no. No, the sheets of parchment have not been stitched together when you make those lines.
They haven't been stitched together?
No, it would be very difficult to write like that. You take one sheet, you write it, put it down. Another sheet, write it, put it down, and then you stitch them.
Okay, so before starting, you have to, that you have enough parchment, or you
today you can probably buy, okay, I need another 3 more, I'll go order another 3 more. Today probably, maybe back in the day they had to be more scrupulous about that, I don't know. Anyway. Okay, so that's between each line, between shita l'shita. The amount of space of your actual lines. Bein teva l'teva, between each word, kamalei ois ktana should be the size of a small letter. bein ois lois, and between each letter, kamole chutasaida, like the amount, like a hair, just the width of a hair. So as long as they're not actually touching. And this is when it comes to checking the kosher validity of a Torah, this is really what they look for a lot of times. Look very, very close at the letter to make sure that there's actually some space between one letter and the next, especially when you're writing these tiny little Torahs or these tiny little mezuzahs or tefillin, and likewise between words. If you're writing very fast, then a lot of times between one word and the next, there's not enough space, and it could look like one long word. It's another thing to look out for. So you have to, between each word, the size of a letter, and between each letter, even like a hair. Now,
these, of course, are minimum.
Sorry? These are all minimum, yes, you can make it bigger, that's correct. As long as it's not too spaced out, then it doesn't look like one word. It looks like a bunch of random letters suspended. Okay. Now he says, Al Yimayit Adam Esaksav, a person shouldn't, in an attempt to keep to the laws of spacing between columns, or between the spacing between lines, or spacing between at the margins, the top of the bottom, he's going to say, you know what, I have to squeeze my letters down much smaller. So I intended to make them a certain size, and now I realize that the score that I made below is too high, and I have to make my letters smaller if I want to get a full-size line space between the top and the bottom. He thinks he might want to do that. Right? So he says, don't do that. The sizing of your letters, that you can read them properly, are more important than the spacings at the end, anywhere. The spacings at the margin at the top, margins at the bottom. Don't do that. He says, a person should not make his letters or his font small, not because of the spacing on the bottom, not because of the spacing on the top of it, and not because he's worried about the line between the space between each line, meaning don't worry about the margins, top or bottom, don't worry about the lines, and don't even be worried about the spacing required between each section of the Torah. I mentioned this before, that chapters that we number in the Torah are not the original chapters of the Torah. The original chapters or sections of the Torah are parshiyos. Parshiyos means a section. And when you get an Aliyah, you'll notice also there are parts in the Torah that have these random spaces. Those are the beginning of the chapters in the original. So there's a certain amount of space you need between each chapter. Some chapters you need to just end wherever you are and go to the end of the line. Empty space at the end of the line. Some chapters need the amount, I think, of 2 or 3 words in between the end of one chapter and the beginning of the next. So if it so happens that you need an extra space for an extra letter, don't worry about the spacing. What's most important is the clarity of your letters. So don't compromise on the clarity of your letters because you're worried about all these spacing issues. Although, of course, you should try to, the best you can, organize yourself that you don't have to violate the laws of the spacing either. Bas Chamesh Oisis. He comes to the end of the line and he has a word that's the next word is 5 letters. The next word he's about to write is 5 letters. Now, he doesn't have space for all 5 letters. So what's the maximum he can do when he's pushing his way out into the margin? We just finished saying, don't make your letters small because you want to squeeze it inside the margin. So that means you're allowing me to write something beyond the margin. So how far out of the margin am I allowed to go? So he says, if you have a word of 5 letters, don't write 2 of them inside the margin. And 3 popping out of the margin, popping beyond the margin. Rather, get 3 inside the margin, and 2 outside the margin. So what he's telling you is the maximum you're allowed to overwrite into the space of your margin is 2 letters. Beyond 2 letters, go to the next line. Or see if you can fit it within the margin. That's the rule.
It's not going to look nice though.
Sorry?
It's not going to look nice.
It's some leeway.
Like something sticking out.
So as long as it's within 2 letters, we're okay with it. This is the halacha. Now he continues. He comes to the end of the line, and now he has only a 2-letter word. He has the word S. 2-letter word. So he might think, but you just gave me leeway and said I'm allowed to make 2 letters beyond the margin, so I can just throw the extra word at the outside of the margin of the column. It says, don't throw that in between your margin, in between your columns. Go back to the beginning of the next line. So in other words, what he's saying is like this. We're allowing you to extend your line 2 letters into the margin, but only if you're middle of a word. Don't start a new word in the margin, even if that word happens to be only 2 letters. Okay. I think we're going to stop over here because now there's a new set of halachas with respect to a person who forgot to write Hashem's name. So he has to go back and create space for himself to stick Hashem's name into his text. So what does he do to do that? And then generally speaking, if he forgets a letter, what does he do in order to get that? If he gets a word, he needs to squeeze that word into his line. What does he do? All right, have a wonderful day, everybody.